Good morning and welcome to the SikaCast, What to Expect in 2020, Developments in the Automobile in 2019, and what that may mean in 2020. I'm Ed Weidman, Executive Director of Sika. Today's webinar is being presented by Susanna Gosch. Susanna is Director, Industry Analyst at CCC Information Services, Incorporated. She has been with CCC since July of 1992. Susanna brings 20 plus years of experience within the automobile claims industry as Director, Industry Analyst. She has also authored the Crash Course, CCC's annual publication on trends impacting collision repair and total loss costs since 1995. This publication has become a key resource for the industry in understanding how broader trends within the economy are impacting auto claim frequency and costs. Ms. Gosch also consults with the ongoing development of CCC's industry-leading data warehouse and reporting products. Ms. Gosch has presented her research at numerous industry meetings and symposiums. In 2011, Ms. Gosch was awarded the annual industry honor of Most Influential Women in the Collision Repair Industry, established by Axle Nobel Automobile and Aerospace Coatings America. She also served on the board for the Women's Industry Network from 2011 until 2017. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you that there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenters. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the webinar navigation pane on your screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And now, I'll turn the program over to Susanna.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for spending some time with us today. I will hopefully provide you with some thought-provoking material that you can apply to your business as we move forward and prepare for 2020. When we look at the auto industry over the last several years, we've heard lots and lots of information about how personal mobility is changing, how we can expect autonomous vehicles to be on the road in great quantities in a short matter of time. We hear a lot about connected cars. We hear a lot about how people are going to not buy cars anymore, instead use only ride-hailing or car-sharing services. But when we look at the actual reality, where we are in 2019, in 2018, 17.33 auto sales were purchased in the U.S., and most of those vehicles were minimally, a relatively small number of those. When you look at the overall population of vehicles, which is about roughly a little bit below 300 million in the U.S., there's really the majority are essentially what we call level 0 from an ADAS perspective, which is advanced driver assistance systems. And so the path to autonomy and to fully autonomous vehicles where people are no longer in charge of the vehicles at all is quite a ways off. But if you look at what happened in 2019, we are starting to see the vehicles that people are buying are becoming more expensive. And a lot of that has to do with the complexity that's being added to them, both from a material perspective, but also from an electronic perspective. For many years, the focus by automakers was around crash worthiness, so protecting the occupant of the vehicle during an accident. And in the last decade or so, a lot of focus has been around crash avoidance. And so incorporation of things like lane detection, lane departure, lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, automatic emergency braking, backup cameras, and the like. And so while we're starting to see many more cars with those, they still make up a relatively small majority of vehicles on the road. And when we look at auto claim frequency, we'll talk a little bit about throughout the course, and particularly at the end, some of the trends that we're seeing specifically there. But after several years of increases in auto claim frequency, we started to see the rate of claims per insured vehicles start to slow. Although because the overall registered vehicle population has continued to grow, the overall number of accidents hasn't really declined significantly. But we'll talk about what we expect to see in the near future related to that, especially as we look at 2020. So if we look specifically at auto sales, as I mentioned, we had in 2018, we had 17.33 auto sales million. And so far this year, most analysts are projecting that we will likely not fully hit another 17 million, which would, if we did, it would make it the 5th consecutive year of vehicle sales of 17 million plus. But most analysts are projecting that sales will come in slightly below 17 million. And if we look at the first 6 months of the year, auto sales were down 2.4%. If we look at the first 9 months of the year, auto sales are actually down only 1.6%. So they have accelerated slightly in the second half of the year, but again, most analysts are expecting auto sales will be down. What's important to note is that the average MSRP of that vehicle consumers are buying now has reached roughly about $35,000, which with median income of the U.S. at about $55,000 makes many vehicles, new vehicles, out of reach for consumers. And so auto affordability has become a major concern among automakers. And subsequently, what we have seen is auto sales on the used side have been quite strong because the large number of returns from lease returns and the like that came from the used wholesale side the demand has been high and kept used vehicle prices high as well, which from a claims perspective, when you have a total loss claim, means that the payout tends to be also escalated as it has been over the last several years. What's also concerning is about 86% of all new vehicle sales are purchased with financing, and the average loan term length in the U.S. now is over 69 months. A lot of that has to do, again, with the fact that people are buying, upping on the trim level when they make their vehicle purchase, but also additionally what we find is that many more people are opting for light trucks. Light trucks were about 69% of all auto sales in 2018, and so far through September, they're almost 72% of all auto sales in the U.S. Subsequently, as we have seen over the last several years, going back to about 2005, the last 15 years or so, we've seen the average MSRP of vehicles climb fairly steadily. And so depending on the source, certain NADA, TrueCar, others, the average price roughly is between about $32,000 and $35,000 now in the U.S. And as we spoke, that becomes quite, in many cases, unaffordable for many consumers. The other thing is, as the cost of the vehicle rises, so too does its cost of repair. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the vehicles themselves have changed. We see many more features in the cars today, requiring more things like power seats, power mirrors, etc. And so subsequently, what we talk about when we look at sort of additional features like in-car entertainment, we have more safety technology focused around crash avoidance and crashworthiness. And some of the crashworthiness, for example, is tied to some of the regulatory requirements. We also have vehicles, for example, that as of May 2018, all vehicles are required to have backup cameras or visibility from a camera in the back of the vehicle. And so many of these features are being added to vehicles. We also have automakers adding additional parts to vehicles, things like sensors and cameras that come with a cost, both upfront and then also from a repair cost perspective. So many of the changes to the vehicle have occurred within the physical structure of the vehicle. So automakers, as they look to lightweight the vehicles to meet emission standards here in the U.S. and globally, are looking to lightweight the content of the vehicles, which becomes particularly challenging as consumers increase and demand larger cars, such as larger SUVs and large-size pickups. But in addition to that, there's many more electronics in the cars for sensors like windshield, rain sensors, backup sensors, sensors and cameras and LiDAR and radar used for all sorts of things that are related to either features for the consumer or are features that are specifically tied to safety. When we look at the average collision loss from about 2003 to about 2017, the annual rate of increase for repairs averaged between about 2% and 3%. In the last several years, we've seen that rate of increase grow pretty substantially, and we're now looking closer between 4 to 5% rate of increase. Collision losses alone, if we look at the data for 2019, it's the first time that we've seen the average collision loss from a loss category perspective versus comprehensive or liability, but the average collision loss hit $4,000 for the first time ever, and that's the data through July of this year on a rolling 12-month basis. But we continue to see the rate of repair costs rise. And when we break the cost of the repair down into its primary components, parts by part type, labor by the different types of labor that we have, and materials and tax and towing, et cetera, what we find is just within the last 15 years that the average repair cost has risen roughly nearly $1,000, or a little bit slightly less than that. But when we break that down into the individual components, about 57% of the overall increase comes from additional costs for replacement parts, some labor associated with those replacement parts, but also additional operations that in many cases are rolling up under what we call our miscellaneous amount. So these would include sublet amount or sublet items or manual entries denoting things like a scan or a calibration, both of which we've seen add additional costs to the repair that frankly didn't even exist before. Scanning, I don't believe I included a slide specifically on that, but roughly 40% of all appraisals now include an entry or at least one entry for a pre or post-repair scan. That doesn't mean that the other 60% are not having a scan performed. It just means that 40% we have an actual record entered into the estimate itself. And the average fee associated with the scan now is about $73. Because many claims include more than one scan, the average scan amount per claim is roughly about $100. Keep in mind as well, if you go back to about first quarter of 2016, only about 3% of appraisals included any entry for scan. So we've essentially added now about $100 per claim fee over the last 2 to 3 years that frankly was never included before. Additionally, as automakers add more technology, which are essentially the building blocks to get to full autonomy, things like LiDAR, radar, cameras, sensors, and the like, many of these parts are being added to vehicles to support customer features and also to support safety and crash avoidance technologies. And so many of these items are placed on the perimeter of the vehicle so that they can sense the surrounding of the vehicle, but then, for example, are highly exposed in an accident. If we look specifically at collision and liability claims over the last several years, the percent that have included the replacement of a camera or a sensor minimally, that percent has grown. Cameras looks like a much smaller number, but the good news with that is that when you look at cameras, many of those, in fact, are actually replaced and removed and replaced, so R&I'd versus having to be replaced. But unfortunately, then you also have potentially the additional labor to not only put that particular part back, but also to recalibrate and ensure it's tied back into the system and operates properly post-repair. The average cost of some of those parts has also grown pretty substantially. Roughly, we've seen about a 1% increase in the aggregate overall cost of replacement parts over the last 5 years. But when you look at some of these additional parts, for example, sensors and cameras, sensors have risen about 60% in the average repair cost or replacement part cost over the last 5 years. And certainly when we look at the cost of some of the technology, as we add more of these to get to additional features and up the sort of increase the levels of autonomy, we will certainly see the increase in the number of those specific parts replaced. I did include a slide here about scan, and this again shows the increase that we've seen over the last several years. As of Q3 2019, roughly about 40% of all claims include a scan entry. And so we've certainly seen that rise, particularly within the newer subset of vehicles, current model year or newer, and the 1 to 3 years old. Those are predominantly the primary vehicles that have a lot of the technology that the automakers are certainly very concerned that we make sure that we've identified any additional parts that may not have done well in an accident and require repair, but you might not otherwise know that it had incurred damage if you had not completed a scan. On the calibration side, there are oftentimes, when you replace a camera, additional labor time automated by the database to do things like aim the camera. But we're finding that in many cases, the automakers' requirements relative to how some of these safety systems should be reset require additional labor time and effort to calibrate and essentially ensure that that system operates properly post-repair. Many of the calibration exercises, as you know, include time set aside to set up a part of the shop where you have area free around the car. You can point the car and those particular cameras or sensors, aim them and make sure that they're aligned properly to specific targets and weights that are unique to each automaker. So the cost to do this in-house is often exorbitant, but it's a necessary step. And so we often find that a lot of the calibrations at this point are being outsourced to dealers or third parties, and the fees for those tend to range pretty substantially across the board. We've seen some fees for a recalibration of a 360-degree camera outsourced to a dealer for as high as about $7,000. So the challenge certainly is for both the shops and the repairs is anticipating the amount of time that some of these exercises will take. Because, for example, if you have to outsource it to a dealer, the dealer may let it sit there for a couple of days. That may not be a priority for them. And additionally, from a insurance company perspective, it's a very difficult thing to underwrite some of these new technologies because oftentimes when you're doing some of these calibrations, you identify additional components that need to be replaced, which leads us to some of those very high fees that we see in the thousands of dollars. But many cases also, the entries are at this point manual entries, so we get sort of a wide range of how these entries are made. But as you can see from the examples on the side is that it's sort of, majority of these have to do with the ADAS type of technologies. Here are just two examples that give you a sense for some of the range in the fees that we're seeing. The top is actually for a 2009 Jetta. It was a claim that actually, in this particular case, was not an ADAS technology per se, but it was actually the steering angle that required a calibration. And you can see that we had a $1,400 fee on a $5,000 estimate. In 2018 Camry example, was a $16,000, almost $17,000 repair. In this particular case, we had the pre-collision radar and the radar cruise systems that needed to be calibrated along with some of the other systems. And so when you add up the fees, you're looking at $782, $264, $198. These can add up pretty substantially across the board. As I mentioned, we've also found examples where as they're in the process of reflashing or recalibrating some of these systems, they may identify additional items that need replacement, and then we'll see fees upwards of $4,000 to $5,000 additional on top of just the actual repair itself. From a cycle time perspective, one of the things that is very clear is that as the average cost of repair increases, we will likely see the average overall keys to keys or vehicle into vehicle out cycle time increase. When you look at that broken into vehicle into repair, repairs started to completed and repairs completed to vehicle out, we find the shops are continuing to do a very good job of reducing or keeping, maintaining a relatively short cycle time for the check-in and check-out process. And the increase itself is occurring, frankly, just in the repair start to repair complete. And for essentially every $1,000 increment in the average repair cost, we see roughly about a 2-day increase in the average keys to keys cycle time. When you get to a repair that's a $10,000 repair and up, we're now looking at over 30 days where that vehicle is in the shop. Anecdotally, we're hearing also from many customers on the insurance side that many are looking to revisit their rental policies because they're finding oftentimes the rental allotment or allowed days in the policy often don't cover the full amount that the vehicle has to be in the shop now. And certainly we've heard, as we look at the GM strike, There are certainly additional implications from parts availability with getting some of the GM parts, where people are running out of rental on those particular claims as well. The other unfortunate side effect of higher repair costs is that the shop productivity, measured labor hours per shop day, tends to fall slightly as the cost of repair rises. Often that's because you have to involve many more different types of technicians. And now we're looking at involving many more technicians with mechanical backgrounds to do some of the things like the calibration and the resetting of some of these electronic systems. But when we look at the CSI, the overall satisfaction of the consumer with both the shop and the insurer, those also decline as we look at the average repair increase. So certainly one of our challenges moving forward is, as the average cost of repair continues to grow, how can the industry maintain productivity, but also ensure that it continues to provide a good experience to the consumer. One of the things that we look at from a overall claim frequency perspective is we are trying to, as an industry, anticipate what the ultimate benefit, but also the ultimate impact will be to a RO count perspective from the incorporation of more ADAS features in vehicles. And so if you look at the advanced driver assistance systems, certain features in the past, for example, electronic stability control, backup cameras, have been mandated by NHTSA. So NHTSA has found enough evidence to mandate that all automakers incorporate that technology. In 2015, 20 automakers met with NHTSA and the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and voluntarily committed that by 2022, all vehicles of 8,500 curb weight or less would be equipped minimally with automatic emergency braking. And at that time, they also voluntarily committed to meeting the testing protocols put in place for both by both NHTSA and IIHS for the AEB systems. And so starting with the 2016 and the 2017 model year, the automakers also committed to reporting out to NHTSA how far along they were towards meeting that full commitment by 2022. And so in model year 2017, about 29% of all of the vehicles made and produced for the U.S. had met the AEB voluntary commitment. By model year 2018, that grew to 45%, and by model year 2019, it's estimated will be roughly at about 48%. Some of the automakers, as you can see, have seen some pretty significant increases over the last several years. Some were already at nearly 100% or at 100%, but certainly we're seeing many more vehicles start to meet that particular commitment. And so it's estimated now that roughly about 15% of all vehicles on the road in the U.S. are equipped with this technology. And so, of course, the question that we all have in the industry is what this will impact, how this will be an impact from the standpoint of accident counts, how well it will do to avoid accidents, and then also from a cost perspective, what might we see from either in an additional or lower cost perspective. What we do know so far, though, is that there are some pretty significant benefits to this technology. Data from IIHS, IIHS has done a great deal of research around the benefits of the advanced driver assistance systems, trying to quantify sort of the overall reduction in claim counts that can be anticipated. But they've also incorporated, testing of the actual systems in their crash tests. And when we look at on the right-hand side of this chart, essentially what this chart illustrates is the outcome of some research that we at CCC completed last year, which specifically looks at a subset of vehicles where you have the very same year, make, and model, where one was equipped with ADAS and one was not equipped with ADAS. And comparing for those two subsets of vehicles for the same type of crash, a collision front impact, grouped by the delta V of the accident, which is essentially the change in force or the speed at which the accident occurred, and grouping those into low, moderate, and high speed. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that the vehicles that are ADAS equipped, in this particular case, minimally automatic emergency braking was the feature we were most interested in. Not surprisingly, those vehicles that were equipped with ADAS had fewer front impacts, likely because we know that technology, those are the types of accidents that it does best at in terms of reducing the frequency. So AEB has been shown to potentially, in direct front to rear accidents, reduce frequency of those types of accidents for the striking car, if it is equipped with ADAS, by about 50%. So subsequently, not surprising to see many fewer of those in the low speed. What's also worth noting is that we found that there were many more from an overall percentage basis that fell into the moderate speed versus the high speed for the ADAS. Certainly some of that has to do with the fact that with fewer in the low speed, you're going to have more in the moderate speed. But because we also have fewer in the high speed, what that tells us is that while these systems may not be able to avoid an accident altogether, they may be designed to, for example, stop the vehicle completely when you're driving up to a speed of 25 miles per hour. But if you're driving 40 miles per hour or more, you may not be able to have the vehicle, technology may not be able to stop the vehicle completely, but at least it will slow the vehicle enough to mitigate the damage and the overall impact to both the car and the occupants of the vehicle. And so the hope is that despite the fact that right now we are seeing added costs to vehicle repairs when this technology is involved and is damaged, ultimately we do hope that as these systems help to mitigate the accident severity, that we will also start to see the overall repair cost decline. Just as this example from IASS showed, where they did a test of in this particular case, it was a Mercedes, and they found that actually when the automatic emergency braking did apply, even though the vehicle was going 40 kilometers per hour, it did slow the vehicle enough so that the damage sustained by the lost vehicle was reduced pretty substantially from a $28,000 repair to about a $5,000 or $6,000 repair. So right now, because the relatively low percent of vehicles on the road that have this technology, we are starting to see some very small but meaningful decline in frequency associated with these features. But sadly, we're, at an aggregate level in particular, we really are not seeing the full benefits of the additional cost savings, but we continue to monitor that very closely. Part of the reason we're seeing some of the sort of a more meaningful reduction in frequency is that if you look at the NHTSA data relative to, and these are police reported crashes, but obviously a good representation of the types of crashes that occur. When you look at the types of crashes with motor vehicle crashes over the last several years, we find pretty consistently that rear end hits are among the most common, and in this particular case, as of 2015, which is the latest data available, that about over a third of all vehicles involved in accidents were involved in a rear end collision. So certainly that's a substantial number of accidents that we see on an annual basis, where there's definitely a collision loss for the striking vehicle and a third-party liability loss for the struck vehicle potentially. But when you look at the overall losses and assume you've got about 34% of all vehicles on the accidents that occur from a rear-end collision, if you've got potentially 15% of people who are driving vehicles equipped with that technology, we are potentially going to see some small but starting to be meaningful reduction in the frequency and the benefits associated with that technology. However, although there's other technology, for example, lane departure warning and blind spot detection that can help with accidents that are less common, such as side swipes and the like, what we are finding is that while the technology works very well in certain situations, there are limitations to it, and the technology varies substantially across automakers in terms of how it's implemented. Some use sensors, some use LiDAR, some use cameras. Those cameras may be mounted behind the grille, they may be mounted behind the windshield, and so each automaker's choice of the technology may result in different requirements relative to how that technology gets repaired and recalibrated. And certainly that's a substantial challenge for repairers, is understanding and having access to the information needed to be able to repair that technology on those vehicles. But unfortunately, we have evidence that people unfortunately have sort of suffer from three things. when we start to look at some of these safety systems and we start to look at vehicle autonomy in general. Role confusion, which is they're not really sure essentially where they take over on behalf of the vehicle. Mode confusion, which is sort of which technology does what and how well it does it. And then also the notion that they are not sort of artificial or overconfident in the capabilities of that technology. And IHS has done some additional research. In addition, there's been a lot of research that's come out of a consortium that's working with MIT that specifically found that people that are using systems such as adaptive cruise control or like Tesla's autopilot system have sort of an overconfidence in the capabilities of that technology or may not fully understand some of its limitations, and so are willing to take on more risky behaviors behind the wheel than somebody that, for example, does not have adaptive cruise control. And so you can see the differences in the percent of drivers who believe that it's okay for them to do things like texting or talking on a cell phone when they're engaged in, and the vehicle is providing some very limited but some level of autonomy. So State Farm recently did a survey that looked at specifically this particular issue. Again, their data is very consistent with what we saw from IHS. But again, we have many people confused about the fact that the capabilities that are included in vehicles today are essentially at the highest level 2 autonomy, which requires that the driver be engaged throughout the process, the driving process, regardless of whether the vehicle is in, for example, autopilot or not. But people sort of put misplaced trust in the capabilities of those systems and are willing, again, to take on much more risky behavior than really they should be. As we look at the overall fleet of vehicles and we talk about sort of the impact of some of this technology to overall frequency, here is a sort of a comparison that gives us some sort of measurement of the impact to date. And it's consistent when we look at claims data and the types of accidents that we see appearing within the claims data as well. But the left-hand side chart shows the distribution of all vehicles, light vehicles in use in the U.S. By the age of the vehicle and the percent over the last 5 years, from 2014 to 2019 through July. And then on the right-hand side, we have a similar distribution, but in this particular case, the distribution of claims, auto claims. And you can see very similar patterns, both in terms of the fact that we have growth in the oldest model year vehicles. A lot of that has to do with the fact that people are holding on to vehicles longer. Vehicles last longer than ever before. And typically on the claim side, it's not surprising to see fewer in that overall older, that 12-year plus segment, largely because many of those vehicles may maintain just the very limited coverage because they're not driven very much or they're not worth, frankly, very much. But one thing that's worth noting is the vehicles that are 0 to 3 years of age, the pattern of increase has been fairly similar, but the last 2 years, we've actually seen on the claim side, the increase not increase at the same rate of increase as we've seen in the vehicles in operation, which has been much more of the pattern in the past. And so this certainly suggests to us that we are starting to see fewer of those newest vehicles that are equipped, roughly 50% of them are equipped with that technology in the overall claim mix. So again, we do believe this is just one example of how we're starting to see some impact from those systems. When we look at overall claim frequency, though, I think, one of the things we continue to look at is sort of a balance of factors. Some factors, for example, that like ADAS are going to be factors that are going to drive down auto claim frequency in the future in many cases. They are not perfect and they don't work in every situation, so certainly there are accidents. If you think about, for example, even comprehensive losses. I had a conversation with an automaker about comprehensive losses and how ADAS comes into play. And they said there is an ADAS feature. It's called a garage. And so, unfortunately, not everybody has a garage, though, so that's not necessarily a mandatory or standard feature. But certainly the mix of claims may change in the future. But when we look at some of the other factors that are driving claim frequency, historically, miles driven has been a very key factor that's been studied and looked at as a correlating factor to driving up or down claim frequency. And as we know, overall miles driven fell substantially during the recession as many people were unemployed and were no longer driving to work. We had some lift in sort of fits and starts coming out of the recession, and then we had a very steady, continuous growth starting in about mid or early 2014. But since the peak, essentially in that growth rate of increase, last year miles driven only grew 0.4% for the full year. And so far through July, the rolling 12-month figure shows us increasing miles in the U.S. is about 0.8%, which is nearly double what we had last year. But miles driven from the government is a combination of private passenger miles, but also commercial miles. And so we believe a lot of the growth is being driven actually from commercial traffic versus private passenger, largely because when we look at frequency on the private passenger auto side, we continue to see claim counts roughly flat through third quarter. And additionally, when we look at auto claims data on the right-hand side of this particular slide, the average miles driven per vehicle has started to, after several years where it actually fell in 16 and 17, we see a moderate increase, but we're still well below where we have been historically. And this is actually a figure that essentially takes the mileage reading of the car for which a claim has been made and divided by the age of the vehicle, which gives us a rough proxy for the number of miles being driven annually on that particular vehicle. But we did see a lift in 2018, and so it remains to be seen what will end up with 2019. But again, we are seeing some factors that point to increase in vehicle use, increase in more cars on the road, which will be factors that will help keep frequency up. We talk a lot about distracted driving. People are still driving distracted. Many more people are moving to urban areas where there's greater congestion. So we will continue to see factors that continue to drive frequency up, but at the same time may ultimately just net out some of the reduction in frequency that we're seeing from any of the new safety technologies. When we look at overall commute times in the U.S., it's sort of a grim picture, frankly. We have more people now spending more time in their car. We have over 8%, almost 9% as of 2016, people that are spending over an hour each way in their commute time. And certainly, despite the fact that we heard that millennials were not going to be buying cars, in point of fact, what we're finding now is that many of those people now have moved out of their parents' homes, are getting jobs, and are getting married and establishing households, and are finding that it's very costly to remain in a city center and are moving out to suburban and ex-urban areas. And that's certainly driving some of the growth in commute times, but also in the growth of auto sales. When we look at some of the data that's put together by different organizations looking at auto congestion, the most recent report by ATRI and the Texas A&M shows that the national congestion cost actually is estimated to grow from $166 billion to $200 billion by 2025, about a 20% increase, and adds about 10 billion hours of lost productivity, essentially. And so, again, this is one of the points that vehicle manufacturers and technology companies are pointing to as a potential benefit for more vehicle autonomy, that people will have the capability to do things versus rather just driving. But today, as I mentioned early on, we see that the majority of vehicles still require the driver to hopefully be focused on the actual driving itself. When we look at the auto claim frequency side, this chart shows the claim frequency data from Fast Track, looking at the claims for 100 insured vehicles. And the overall trend continues to point down. And after seeing some lifts during sort of 15 and 16, we're now essentially seeing frequency level with essentially where it was in about 2007. But it continues to, as of Q2, also trend down. And when we look at CCC claim counts counted for changes in customers, we find that actually claim counts are essentially flat. total loss frequency is up well over 19% now. And so repair counts are actually down, but total loss counts are up, netting us out essentially at roughly a flat number to where we were for the first 3 quarters of 2018. On the flip side, however, we are continuing to see costs rise. If we look at overall claim costs for the industry, last year they were up about a little bit over 4%. Based on what we've seen so far through the first 9 months of this year, we anticipate that claim costs overall, which would involve both repairs and total losses, may be up as much as 5.5% for the full year. But certainly repair costs are accelerating, and are accelerating for some of the newest model year vehicles, much more so than the older. The gap in the average repair cost for those that are current model year versus 7 has grown to over 72% over the last 5 years alone, versus just over about 50% 5 years ago. So while we expect and can certainly are tracking the fact that some of these advanced driver assistance systems are starting to have a small but meaningful impact on frequency, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we are not yet fully seeing some of the benefits from at an aggregate level and overall from an industry-wide perspective in a meaningful reduction in repair costs. We are seeing people spend more time behind the wheel and in more congested traffic, and those are situations certainly that front to rear where ADAS will come into play quite a bit and should help also temper overall frequency. But in the meantime, what the industry is facing is a lot of challenges relative to how to repair this new technology, the new steps involved, the new technology and training required, and also ensuring that documentation exists to ensure that the technology and the repair steps have been followed. And so that will continue to be a challenge as we move forward as well. So I'll be happy to take questions now, and I appreciate everybody's participation and time today, and I'll hand it back over to Ed.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and a very thorough presentation. Appreciate that. I really don't have any questions at all with you. I do have one, but I really don't understand it. Behind the AEB equipped vehicle was the question. Does that make sense to you, or?
AEB or ABB?
AEB.
AEB, I believe, is automatic emergency braking.
Yes.
Was there a question? Okay.
Oh,
and was there?
When do you see the ADAS catching up on commercial vehicles like tractor trailers?
So on the fleet side, it's quite interesting because there is a lot of desire to improve the overall capabilities on the commercial side as well. Certainly, as commercial traffic grows, as we see more e-commerce, we see a lot more commercial traffic, and we see a lot more commercial traffic in very congested areas, sort of that last mile problem. On the fleet side, we're seeing more on the new trucks being developed, sort of the class 8 and lower, more fleet managers are interested in ensuring that those vehicles have that technology. Oftentimes it's being added on an individual fleet by fleet basis as an aftermarket item. So not necessarily coming from the actual OE, although many of the newest model year vehicles are incorporating that. But certainly the focus of the 20 automakers was primarily on the private passenger vehicle. There is additional commitment that by 2025, I believe, vehicles up to 10,000 pounds and lower would all be equipped with AEB. So there's certainly a period of time where we'll have vehicles that fall sort of in that mid-size 8,500 pound to 10,000 pound that will not necessarily be equipped, because few automakers have those vehicles equipped with that technology, or have, and commitment date is obviously later. But it takes a long time for the vehicle fleet to be replaced. And certainly when you're looking at some of the commercial vehicles, the upfront costs are pretty substantial. So the replacement cycle time may be delayed even further.
Great. Hey, another question that came up was AEB is reducing front impact severity frequency. Is there any evidence of an increase in rear end damage severity and frequency caused by other vehicles that can't stop in time behind the AEB equipped vehicle?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting point. So if you look at in California, California is the only state that requires that companies that are testing autonomous vehicles on the road report the details of any accidents that occur. And if you break down the accidents, which is not a huge number, but it's roughly about a couple hundred, the vast majority of those are rear end hits. And so the question becomes, are those vehicles driving vastly different than what a human-driven vehicle is, and subsequently the person driving behind them is not able to anticipate the change in the speed of the vehicle, or is it braking much faster than a human-driven vehicle? And I think that's really sort of a key illustrator of how the technology is going to potentially respond differently than what we've seen humans do. And so while there isn't a great deal of evidence, there was actually some work done by IHS that looked at frequency of accidents and compared when the vehicle was rear-ended, when it was the struck vehicle and it was equipped with that technology versus the striking vehicle. And they found that about 50%, if the ADAS-equipped vehicle was the striking vehicle, there was about a 50% reduction in frequency. But their evidence actually did point to, although they said the overall number was not statistically enough significant, but that the vehicle as ADAS equipped actually had a higher, about a 20% increase in the instances in which it was rear-ended. And so that would certainly suggest that we are seeing some differences in terms of how those vehicles react in an accident, and people behind them not necessarily anticipating that. So certainly there's some challenges as more of this technology, and I think it's just indicative of the challenges that we are going to have as an industry underwriting some of these technologies. How effective are they in all different types of situations, but also understanding the differences as we have a mixed fleet for many years on the road in the U.S. and how often we'll see combinations of accidents where we have some vehicles equipped and some vehicles not equipped with ADAS, and what the outcomes of those accidents might look like.
Another question that we have is, do you see an increase in dealer-only repair parts due to extreme rigid repair method requirements?
So in general, when we look at labor, overall labor hours and costs, and the sort of distribution between labor operations that would be considered sort of repair operations versus replace, and also parts repaired versus replaced, we have seen over the last several years, 5 to 10 years, a slow but steady shift towards more replacement. And some of that has to do with certainly cycle time requirements. If people can get the parts there very quickly, oftentimes that becomes a reason why they may replace a part versus repair. Technician shortage in some case may be part of the issue, but in many cases it frankly comes down to the fact that the part itself may be a component that actually cannot be repaired and must be replaced. So when you look at many of these additional types of parts like cameras and sensors, certainly there's potentially many fewer options as it relates to repairing versus replacing. And certainly even from a part type perspective, there's at this point in time limited non-OE options as well.
Thank you. A question came up about one of the stats that you displayed, and that is do the miles driven statistics you shared include ride car share miles?
Yes,
You know?
and actually, yes, and although it's not necessarily, it historically obviously was not even a service that existed up until, you know, probably the mid 2000s. But essentially, in some of the National Household Survey data now, the government is tracking the use of a vehicle for hire, which historically has been largely taxi cabs, but they're trying to separate out some of the, specifically keeping taxi versus the ride for higher miles. But in general, there has been a fairly significant increase in the percent of people that say that they have used those services. If you look at some of the ride-hailing statistics, though, there's an organization out of New York City, Schaller Consulting, that's done a lot of research on this. Last year, we actually published an article specifically looking at ride-hailing and some of the statistics around that. But essentially, about 60% of all the ride-hailing miles are in about 9 metro areas. But it's anticipated that because many of those are relatively short distance, that ride-hailing miles only account for about 0.5% of all miles driven in the U.S. today. But it's certainly seen some substantial growth because it, you know, went from that 0 over a relatively short period of time.
Thank you. Based on your research, do you think in the future that cars without safety items will be legislated off the road?
So actually, during the Obama administration, there was a proposal to require a couple of things. One was looking at the advanced driver assistance systems, but also looking at vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity. And V2V, or vehicle to I, you know, to vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to, you know, V2, you know, sort of everything. There have been and are believed to be a great deal of potential benefit from those particular systems. That was one particular item that the Obama administration had put out for comment, the NHTSA organization during the Obama administration, to propose requiring vehicles be equipped with that technology, not only from an OE perspective, but also that become a mandatory feature of any vehicle on the road. Unfortunately, that particular proposal was sort of put aside. We have an administration now that is obviously very anti-regulation. So I would anticipate that we, at least in the current administration, we're not going to see anything additional moving towards requiring that technology be made standard on all vehicles. There's some technology like Mobileye and other vendors that actually have those types of systems available, and they have seen some modest uptick in, you know, benefit or reduction in frequency from some of those systems as well. But I think at this point, given the fact that very little movement is being made, even on sort of the regulations related to the testing and implementation of autonomous vehicles, that we're not going to see much happen in that in the near future.
Along with that question, there's another question that came up, and that is when do you believe that vehicle-to-vehicle communication will start to evolve and be implemented?
Well, I think it's been, to a certain extent, at this point, given the fact that the proposal for sort of the implementation of vehicle-to-vehicle technology serve as an independent feature separate from vehicle autonomy, that's essentially been put on hold. I think any additional movement forward on vehicle-to-vehicle technology will be part and parcel with some of the vehicle autonomy features that are being added. But there's certainly been a lot of benefit shown from that technology. And automakers obviously are adding a great deal more technology that allows for connectivity to the network in general. So I think we may see more vehicles slowly start to have that technology, but I don't expect to see any significant development on that. I think it will just be very slow in the near term. Thank you.
Let's finish with one last question. Do you expect the total loss percentages to increase or decrease over the next 5 years as a result of this technology?
So when you, our upcoming CCC Trends article will look specifically at that, but what we find is that total loss frequency is essentially up in every age group of every vehicle. So whether it's a current model year vehicle or a vehicle that's 16 years of age and older, total loss frequency is up across the board. The percent increase is up most for the newest model year vehicles. And a lot of that, frankly, at the end of the day, comes down to the cost of the repair and how we're seeing the cost of the repair accelerate pretty substantially. I think in the next 2 years, we'll continue to see total loss frequency rise. And then I think after that, it becomes a question of how well some of the ADAS capabilities are at helping to reduce the severity of the accidents and potentially sort of flatten or at least reduce the increases in the repair costs that we're now experiencing in the short term, where we're seeing increases of roughly 5% annually. But I do think hopefully after about 2 years, some of that will flatten out. The other is that, you know, if you look at, for example, the registered vehicle data on the one slide, there are quite a few older model year vehicles out there, and there is a life expectancy for those. There is a period of time where eventually those will be taken off the road. And so if there are fewer older model year vehicles, obviously that's going to have where their total loss frequency is the highest. As more of those just simply get taken off the road in general, that hopefully should help after about the 2-year mark.
Well, thank you very much, Susanna. That's an excellent presentation. Our next CECAcast is scheduled for Tuesday, November 12th at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. Stephen Abelbaum will be discussing the impact of new technologies on the auto physical damage and claims ecosystem. You can find a full schedule of future broadcasts on CECA.com using the Events tab at the top of the page. CECA has partnered with the Automobile Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar can take a short quiz on the AMI website to earn credit toward a professional designation. A link to AMI and a coupon code is available on CECA.com. Please follow CECA's media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and CECA news. Thank you. This concludes today's webinar.